could do some follow-up experiments, and that's good. And we are putting together a plan to slowly start testing a few patients,
Yeah, they're basically saying, well, I know that my colleagues in Hershey, they get permission to run patients, but they have to make a statement that these experiments are not just experiments, but they're important for patients.
Okay.
That they may affect the treatment plan, they may affect this and that, and so then they say, okay, it's an essential study, and they allow that.
I see.
But they don't allow research for research sake.
Research. I see.
So we're still waiting for our bosses to give us permission to run experiments, but it's not going to happen very soon, I'm afraid.
Yeah. So we've been writing a lot of applications. There is some deadlines coming from the Paralyzed Veterans of America. So that's the one deadline where some of the fellows in the lab can submit applications, the ones that are not Americans, and we just submitted VA funding also.
Nice.
For the VA. So we've been writing.
Hi, Gregor.
Hello.
Hi.
Now I'm checking the quality of the streaming.
Okay.
And you have cut your hair, Mark.
Not me, another person did it.
Yeah. I need to do that.
At home, because our hairdressers, shops, and salons are basically closed, or they're very complicated to handle. So we're getting, we got Gregor, we're getting Richard, number one. First, Richard.
Hi, Richard.
Hello, Richard. How are you?
Good to see you.
So, we still have a few minutes.
How are you all?
We're fine.
Well, we are so far so good. Thank you. And
we are already online on YouTube and Facebook.
So we should try to be polite.
Marco, hey.
Yes.
Hello.
Morning. Hi, morning, guys.
Good morning.
Hi, Marco.
Hi. Good morning.
Morning.
Okay. Waiting a few more minutes.
But Mark, if you are running any experiments, do you have to add, for example, in the consent term, that if something happens with the person about the coronavirus, you are not...
No, we're too far from that. I think that they're not allowing us currently to run experiments, so that's period.
Yeah.
I don't think they would require adding specifically about coronavirus anything into the subject information form, because it's really ridiculous, kind of obvious. But I don't know. I mean, administrators invent surprising things sometimes. I wonder where the Feldmans are.
Yeah.
They usually turn on before everybody else does.
They usually they are the first.
I think Richard Nichols is not here. It's not gonna.
Yes, Richard Nichols may have problems joining, but Feldmans, I would expect, well, at least I didn't receive any emails or anything from them speaking to the opposite. So we'll give them another couple of minutes.
Luis, I didn't respond to your email. Just actually read it now. I wonder if This idea to use the text files.
Yes.
I'm not sure exactly how that will work.
Because I saw that I can add, for example, captions for all the presentations. Hi, Bob. And I don't know if all of you, automatic. And then if you want it, we could have the text file with all the captions. That would mean could be a kind of chapter for each presentation. I don't know if you would like to have that, all of you.
Yeah, I think that the captions might be good for people where sometimes the auditory quality isn't so good, or maybe non-native speakers who might be helped understanding this way.
Yes.
I'm not sure that the text file is really useful that way. We don't speak maybe well enough for that to be as a text, to be really printable.
Well, anyway, something that I'm gonna do is I did ask Anatol to send me his presentation, because then I'm gonna synchronize his audio with the presentation again. Then I can have a better quality of the video.
Okay. Yeah, I thought it would be nice if we could make our slides available, for those where that works. We did that in the past. I don't know exactly how through. I think we sent it back by email. I don't remember how that was done.
Well, I think I sent a couple of times. I sent by email. At some point, the slides were so huge for some of the presentations. The files were monstrous. So. Right. I think we once did a Dropbox that people could access.
Right. Is it easy to upload those on the PMC, on the motor control, the society website?
I think we tried once. These are very large files, particularly for regular motor control summer schools, when those were 3-hour talks. And people used animations and showed movies and a lot of photos. So these were slides in dozens of megabytes. So emailing wasn't an option at that time. Dropbox was okay. Well, we can think about it. And
you could do a combination. We could upload them to Dropbox, and then on the Society for Motor Control website, you could have a pointer for each thing to the Dropbox file.
Yeah, that's a possibility. There is another possibility, is just turning them into a PDF.
Yeah,
and then forget about all the videos and all those expensive memory-hungry
that would be enough.
Add-on.
I know that even the PDFs can be pretty large, so email is probably not reasonable. And also now we have an audience where we might not even know all the email addresses. But if we could upload it somewhere, and we could put maybe on YouTube, we could put the link into the comment text. Well, ideal would be if we could just have that on the society webpage. Would be more permanent. I don't know how easy it is to edit that web page.
Well, we cannot edit it. It can be edited only by Leah Feldman currently, because she's the webmaster, and she has been the webmaster for the past.
She's watching us.
Quite a few years. Good.
So she has sent a hello to you too.
We may ask Leah this question, whether there is a possibility to upload, well, either complete files or maybe watered down files without movies and things like that, like PDF.
And something else I'm doing now, I ask my students, they are watching all the presentations again and taking all the references. And this is, and have a list of all the references and all the files.
We will stop waiting. So we are going to begin our session. So everybody please turn off your microphones, except Monica, of course. And it's great to have Monica because she's been a wonderful colleague, friend, and speaker at Motor Control Summer School quite a few times already. Her talks are always very exciting because she's excited about what she's talking about, and she kind of manages to get the sense of excitement to the audience. So I hope we're up for another very exciting talk. So Monica, please do it, and I turn off my mic.
Okay.
So share your screen.
Can you, is it okay? Yes? Okay, so thank you very much, Mark. It's wonderful to be here and have this chance to share with all of you some of the work that we do in our laboratory. So during the last several years, we have been trying to characterize changes in different neuronal pathways in the brain, in the spinal cord, and their contribution to the control of voluntary movement, and also try to assess how these electrophysiological outcomes can help us to enhance the assessment of our patients with spinal cord injury. In addition, we try to use these sensitive neurophysiological outcomes to try to develop interventions that might aim to recovery function and help us to recover most function in people with spinal cord injury. So today, during my presentation, I'm going to mainly try to address three primary questions. And the first one is, how does the human spinal cord changes after the injury, and the effects of these changes in the assessment of sensory function, motor function, as well as spasticity, which is some of the new data that we have recently published from our laboratory. And also give you a couple of examples of how more sensitive measurements, and when I refer to sensitive measurements, most of them are based on electrophysiology, can be useful to help the diagnosis of people, help to assess spasticity, for example, interactions between the left and the right side of the body, and corticospinal transmission. And the last part of my presentation, I will try to show you some of the new advances that we have made in one of the neuroplasticity protocols that we have been using for the last several years. I will tell you why do we think it's so important to keep refining this protocol in order to perhaps have stronger effects in voluntary motor output in patients with spinal cord injury. So according to the National Spinal Cord Injury Statistical Centers, this was just recently updated in their website this year, there are over 17,000 new cases of spinal cord injury every year in the United States. We also know that more than 290,000 people is living with spinal cord injury. 78% of spinal cord injuries occur in men. And in the 1970s, the average age for spinal cord injury was 29 years old. But this has been changing over the years. And since 2015, the average age is 43 years old. So the most common neurological level for spinal cord injury continues to be tetraplegia. This means that the cervical spinal cord is damaged, and therefore most patients have deficits in upper and lower limb function. It's still the case that more than 75% of all spinal cord injuries are a result of a trauma, and contusion is the main mechanism of spinal cord injury. So this is the data that was published in the late 1990s and 2000 about the causes for spinal cord injury in the United States. And this is the latest report this year. And you can see that one of the main causes for spinal cord injury is motor vehicle accidents. And this has been remained in terms of percentage of cases more or less constant during the last 20 years. But there have been some changes in the cause for a spinal cord injury. So in the light green area, you can see that in 2000, approximately 21% of spinal cord injuries were due to falls. But this number has been increasing, and we have now, as a cause of injury, 32% of individuals are the result of a spinal cord injury is due to an intentional fall. Something that has been reducing, which is the number of spinal cord injuries related to violence, and this is related primarily to gunshots. In 2000, approximately 25% of all spinal cord injuries were related to gunshots. But today in the United States, the injuries are approximately 14%. And this number has been dramatically decreased. The number of spinal cord injuries due to sports or other causes has remained more or less constant. This is consistent with a study that was published in JAMA in 2012, showing you a survey, the results of an inpatient database, and showing you unintentional falls as the cause for spinal cord injury in 1997 of all the patients who enter acute hospitals, have acutely a spinal cord injury, where all the spinal cord injuries, 20% of them were due to an unintentional falls. And this number was increasing progressively, and it doubles approximately in 2012. However, the number of spinal cord injuries due to a motor vehicle accident has been maintained constant from 1997 to 2012, which is very much in agreement with the reports from the National Spinal Cord Injury Statistical Center database. So it is important to consider, and especially for all of us who are working in motor control, that most spinal cord injuries in humans are anatomically incomplete. One of the first large studies was published around 1980. There are a few reports by Byron Kakulas from the University of Western Australia. And what he did is show in post-mortem analysis of spinal cords that around 75% of individuals with a clinical diagnosis of a complete spinal cord injury show some evidence of continuity of CNS tissue across the injured segments. And he tested from the 67 patients who were categorized as clinically complete, 50 of them show some evidence of continuity. So you can see it's a large number of patients who have evidence of continuity throughout the injured segments. Another large study was completed in 1993 by Richard Bunge, the Miami Project to Cure Paralysis, and he did an histological analysis at the epicenter of the lesion, and his analysis revealed that around 62% of the spinal cord specimens that were tested show some evidence of continuity through the CNS parenchyma. From those individuals, 16 patients who were clinically complete, 50% of them show also evidence of continuity across the injured segment. So you can see that the numbers fluctuate between 50%, 75%. And if we go to some of the behavioral studies or electrophysiological studies, there are several examples, but one of the examples that I cite the most is a paper published in 2017 by Hunter Peckham, because he carefully selected a group of patients with only cervical spinal cord injury, and he recorded from different upper limb and lower limb muscles, and then he asked individuals to perform different levels, so attempt to perform voluntary contractions in muscles that were located below the level of the injury. And these individuals had a complete sensory motor complete or sensory complete ASIA A or B, and according to the clinical diagnosis. And he found that between 60 and 70% of these patients show some EMG or electromyographic activity in muscles below the level of the injury. So this is extremely important for our diagnosis and also for understanding and not only assessing patients, but also for documenting progress of changes in patients across time post-injury. So the other important issue to consider is that the spinal cord is damaged bilaterally after the injury. So these are three different images from three different patients who had a spinal cord injury for several years. This individual had a contusion injury on the left side at the cervical region due to a motor vehicle accident. This individual had a contusion at the high thoracic level due to a motor vehicle accident. And this individual had a laceration in the lumbar spinal cord due to a gunshot. So you can see that all injuries look quite different anatomically, but there are still a few characteristics that is very important I want to highlight. There is a massive loss of tissue in the spinal cord. And this is, you can see here, the formation of a number of cavities. And these cavities are present in both sides of the spinal cord. There is a rim of tissue also that is surrounding the spinal cord. And this is important because some of that is in the dorsolateral or the lateral parts of the spinal cord where the white matter tracts are located. Therefore, there might be some connections to the spinal motor neurons. Apart from being bilateral injuries, it's very important to remember that in several cases, injuries are asymmetric. So you can see in this example that there is massive loss of tissue in one side of the spinal cord compared to the other side. And this is also clearly observed in this individual with a laceration. So more tissue loss in one side compared to the other one. So individuals, when we think about patients with spinal cord injury, if both limbs are affected, we have to think about bilateral assessments and bilateral strategies. So this individual here, we ask him to reach and grasp with the left hand, very difficult with the right arm, extremely difficult. So they start using bilateral strategies in order to successfully accomplish the task. But there are some asymmetries, and these asymmetries are more clear in patients with, I'm going to show you this example, which shows a large asymmetry in motor behavior. We ask this individual with a high cervical injury to reach and grasp an object with the left arm, the left hand, and he was able to successfully accomplish this task with the right arm. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that we have, most of the time, there are asymmetries. They're not as pronounced as this example, but the asymmetries exist. And it's very important to consider when we assess patients or when we quantify not only motor behavior, sensory outcomes, spasticity, and I'm going to show you a couple of examples that are very important for motor control. So one of the main difficulties in characterizing these assessments or these asymmetries in behavior and sensory and motor function is because some of the clinical exams that we use for these quantifications are not sensitive enough to detect asymmetries. So we use the international standards for neurological classification of spinal cord injury, which is the InSCI exam, to assess the level of injury and also the extent of spinal cord injury. So we assess sensory and motor function using a light touch, a pinprick, a manual muscle test. And these examinations are based on nominal scales. We go from 0 to 2 or 0 to 5, depending on the exam. And we also quantify the extent of the injury by using the American Spinal Injury Association impairment scale. So an individual can be classified as an AIS A, which means no sensory or motor function, below the level of the injury, or is a clinically complete spinal cord injury, and we have different degrees of incomplete injuries. And an individual with an AIS-B is incomplete in terms of no motor function is preserved below the level of the injury, but we still have some remaining sensory function. And we still have different degrees of impairment or recovery of sensory and motor function in individuals with AIS-C and D. So because of the nature of this, the clinical exam is very difficult to detect asymmetries or bilateral differences in sensory or motor function. So I'm going to show you one example of a test that we did several years ago with Richard McLean, and we tried to use electrophysiological outcome to detect these asymmetries in sensory function. So what we did is to use the electrical perceptual threshold, and we went to the same dermatomes that are used in the clinical exam and the same motor points of the dermatomes. And instead of using a light touch or a pinprick, which is currently what we use in the clinical exam, we use electrical pulses, 3 pulses per second, and we asked individuals when they were able to perceive the stimulation. So this here shows you a graph of an example of a representative patient. In the x-axis, you can see the intensity that we use in milliamps. In the y-axis, you can see the dermatomes that we tested from C2 to T4. The black circles show the data in control subjects. So you can see that across the dermatomes, in this individual, we need less than 2 milliamps. Approximately 2 individuals can perceive the electrical stimuli. And the dashed line shows data to values 2 standard deviations above the mean of the control subject. The gray circles show the data in a patient with spinal cord injury. According to the clinical exam, or the INSCI sensory level for this patient was C6. That means that residual sensory function was preserved at the C6 segmental level, but with this electrophysiological test, we were able to detect a spare sensory function, several segments below the level of the injury, and also some asymmetries. So an individual, this patient needed more intensity in these segments in order to perceive the stimuli. So we tested a number of patients with chronic cervical spinal cord injury, and you can see in this example, this patient had according to the clinical exam, an injury at C5 and this patient at C4. And you can see that this is the gray lines show you the data from our electrophysiological test. We detected spare sensory function, several segments below the level of the injury, and importantly, asymmetries between the sides, which is impossible to be detected unless you go to the zone of partial preservation. But the single neurological level that is provided by the exam does not allow you to detect this degree of changes. So our results show on those years that in the chronic stage of spinal cord injury, cervical spinal cord injury, the electrical perceptual threshold can reveal spare sensory function between around 5 segments below the level of the injury, which is what is detected by the clinical exam. Then we try to understand if these changes were happening and was any relationship with the time post-injury. We observed a significant inverse correlation between the time post-injury and the differences between the clinical and the physiological exam. So this information generated the continuation study where we longitudinally went and assessed discrepancies between the sensory exam, clinical exam, and the electrical perceptual threshold. So you can see in the first graph, these are 45 patients that we tested. These individuals in the first part of the graph had an acute spinal cord injury less than 6 months post-injury. These are individuals with a spinal cord injury for 1 to 10 years. And these are individuals who had a spinal cord injury for over 10 years. And this is one side of the body, and this is the other side of the body in each one of the subjects. The triangles show the data or the level of sensory function detected by the clinical exam, and this is what we detected with this electrophysiological test. And I just want to bring to your attention the data in the chronic phase of spinal cord injury between 1 to 10 years, which is where we observe the main discrepancies between the clinical exam and our electrophysiological test. And also we detected asymmetries in patients. For example, there is preservation of sensory function one level below the level of the injury, but in the same patient here, I hope you can see my cursor, is more than one segment below the level of the injury. So when we put the data together in the chronic phase, 1 to 10 years post-injury, you can see that there are a number of asymmetries in terms of the level of sensory function that is detected by the clinical exam when we use this electrophysiological outcome. The clinical exam does not detect this level of sensitivity. So then we decided to ask, are there other functions that also are affected by this asymmetrical damage in the spinal cord? And this paper was recently published in Journal of Neurophysiology and was conducted by Bing Chen, who is one of my fellows in the laboratory. And what Bing did is to first test spasticity in people with chronic incomplete spinal cord injury using the clinical exam. One of the clinical exams is the modified Ashville scale. So he tested 24 patients, and in the x-axis you can see the modified Ashville scale values. For 0 means no spasticity, and this is the maximum 4, which is a severe restriction of the movement and severe resistance to the stress. And you can see that in the majority of the patients, the clinical exam was insensitive to detect differences between spasticities. This was done in plantar flexor muscles, and you can see that the values of terms on the left plantar flexors were very similar to the right plantar flexors. In fact, only 25%, in 25% of the patients, we were able to detect asymmetries. What was very interesting is just Bing also constructed a questionnaire and asked patients, just by asking them, do you have more spasticity in one of the sides of your body, left or right leg? And they reported asymmetries. Patients reported asymmetries 96% of the cases. And the clinical exam only detected asymmetries in 25% of the cases. So we were able to use a dynamometer from that we borrowed from Jens Bo Nielsen from his group from the University of Copenhagen, where we can assess stiffness in the muscle coming and from changes in muscle, passive muscle properties, and also in reflex or active properties. So what Bing did is to use this dynamometer and perform stretches at slow speed, around 20 degrees per second, or also at fast velocities of around 300 or more degrees per second. And we recorded electromyographic activity in the soleus muscle and also at times in the TA muscle, tibialis anterior. So this is data from a representative control subject on the left side, and this is a patient with spinal cord injury. So this is the torque that is generated during 20 seconds of passive slow movements or slow stretches. So you can see the two lines. I hope you can see the lines clearly, but this is the left and the right side, and there are no major differences in the control subject. But in a patient with spinal cord injury, the resistance is increased, and we were able to detect some asymmetries between the left and the right side of the body. Then we tested, we completed...
Excuse me. May I ask you a question? May I ask you a question with respect to the previous picture? Mm-hmm. Because, of course, I'm thinking now about Mindy's talk and about her suggestions that with spasticity, what changes is the threshold of the stretch reflex rather than the gain. In this picture, it's hard to say because I wonder if the threshold is the point where the slope of the line changes dramatically. The previous part was due to non-reflex resistance of tissues, and then the reflex kicked in. So it looks like the orange curve is not that different from the controls, while the brown one is.
Yeah, this is the passive stretch. So when we go to the active or the stretch reflex, this is the data from the fast reflexes or the stretch reflexes. So we measure the stretch reflex and also the peak reflex torque generated by the stretch reflex. So what is interesting here is that you can see that the stretch reflexes, these are the green values show data of the amplitude of the peak amplitude of the stretch reflex in control subjects on the left and right side, and you see no asymmetries, okay? But when you are testing people with spinal cord injury, you see that stretch reflexes are larger in patients compared to controls, but there is a huge asymmetry. And I asked Pim to construct this figure to make the point a little bit more clear, because from the 24 patients that we tested, so on the left side of the graph, you can see individual data on passive muscle stiffness on the left side and the right side. And this is active or reflex-mediated stiffness on the left and right side in the same patient. But you can see that the asymmetries in passive muscle stiffness are much more pronounced when you look at reflex mechanisms. So compared to passive mechanisms, but there are also asymmetries in passive mechanisms. And we think when you put all these results together, it's very difficult for the clinical exam to, on top of that, to detect asymmetries or be more sensitive, because all these differences in passive stiffness, active reflex-mediated mechanisms are tested together. Okay, during the clinical exam. During the clinical exam, the modified Ashville scale, you have to stretch the muscle in 1 second, complete fast stretches, but both mechanisms can be contributing to the increased resistance that you get from the muscle when you are performing the clinical exam. So, and at the same time, we have asymmetries in these two outcomes, which makes it even more difficult for the clinical exam to be able to detect asymmetries. Actually, there is a figure that it is in the paper, but I'm not showing it here. We found that approximately in 83% of the cases, the clinical exam might be contaminated by changes in passive muscle stiffness and to some extent reflex mechanisms too. So it's extremely difficult to have a sensitive assessment or a more detailed assessment by just using the clinical exam. So we suggest the use of these other methodologies to increase the sensitivity, as other groups are also using. Another important...
Annika?
Yes.
Could I ask you, I don't know if I missed this, but are the lesions asymmetrical?
Yes. Let me go back. Of course, this is an example, Bob, of a few lesions, and you can see in this patient that the anatomical lesion is much more, the loss of tissue is more massive in this side of the spinal cord compared to the other one, okay? And if you see on this laceration due to a gunshot, also there's massive loss of tissue, it's more pronounced in one of the sides of the spinal cord compared to the other one. So usually, because the main mechanism after spinal cord injury is a contusion injury, usually injuries are bilateral and usually are asymmetric also. It's very difficult to quantify for us because, you know, this is post-mortem tissue and also we do clinical exams, but in our experience, we have been quantifying bilateral differences in reaching and grasping movements, spasticity, sensory assessments, and I think the majority of patients have these asymmetries. Sometimes it's not that easy to see because the asymmetry is like in a stroke. You have the paretic limb and the non-paretic limb, so they're extremely pronounced.
So do you assume that because the plot that you were just on, where you showed the quantification for each patient of left and right reflex, active and passive components, it looked like there's general population bias for your patients. Do you think that's so that the left is higher than the right? Do you think that's because in that group of patients you had greater lesions on the left overall?
Yeah, I mean, because lesions are asymmetric, it's very important to, when we look at the patient with spinal cord injury, to think that it's very likely that sensory function, motor function, or spasticity or other outcomes could be differentially affected by the injury, by just the anatomical damage to the spinal cord. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but we just try to make sure that people take this into consideration. I mean, that doesn't mean that you cannot compare patients, but if I'm going to test a patient today and I test the left arm, and then I'm going to test them, a couple of weeks later, or I'm going to test the right arm, there could be that there is an asymmetry and the deficit is more or less just by the side that I'm testing. Or also, what we have found that discrepancies in the literature. Some people said, oh, no, we have increased passive stiffness, muscle stiffness in patients with spinal cord injury. Others said no. Or people say, oh, no, we have larger reflexes. And others say, well, it's not that true, especially with age reflexes. There is a tremendous controversy. So some of the controversies could look, because in some papers they are looking at the left side or they're looking at the right side or the more or less affected side. So I think it's important to start taking in consideration, because that might contribute to some extent to the discrepancy in the literature. If I test the less affected side, maybe my patient looks more normal than the other side. And maybe the less affected side also is still affected, but not to the degree that the other side. So I think it's something important to consider. So do you have any other thought? Or?
No, thank you very much. That was very thorough.
Okay, so another example of why these sensitive measurements, we think, and this is one of our recent studies published just recently last year, and this study, I found it extremely beautiful. It was conducted by Sina Sangari, which is one of the fellows in our laboratory. So what Sina did is to call a group of patients, I think it was 33 patients, with the diagnosis of a clinically complete spinal cord injury. And we were very interested in trying to understand how many of these individuals have descending connectivity. They have a diagnosis of a clinically complete spinal cord injury, and we assess descending connectivity. And also, I will show you in the next slide some symptoms of spasticity. So he stimulated the leg representation of the primary motor cortex. He recorded from the quadriceps muscle. We use electrical and magnetic stimulation over the primary motor cortex. And at the same time, he also sent patients to the scanners to try to get an understanding of the volume of changes in volume of the spinal cord at a similar time after the injury. So importantly, what he found that there was two groups of patients with clinically complete spinal cord injury. And this is extremely important because 60% of patients show spasticity. Spasticity, I just told you that there are outcomes that are not very sensitive, but still Okay, we use two different exams. We use the modified Ashville scale, and we also use the pendulum test. We tested the spasticity in the quadriceps muscle. So this was really below the level of the injury. Oh, sorry for that. Can you see my presentation? Yes. Okay. So what he found is that 60% of these patients have spasticity, and 39%, almost 40% of patients did not show any signs of spasticity. So this is just a detailed analysis of the modified Ashville scale, showing you that within the patients who have spasticity, 5% of them have more severe spasticity. So the question is, how does descending connectivity is changing in these two populations, one group who have severe spasticity and the other one with no spasticity? So we use transcranial magnetic stimulation and electrical stimulation, and these show you individual recordings from 3 different patients. The red dots show you data from individual patients with spasticity. This is the degree of spasticity detected by the modified Ashville scale, and this is the level of the injury. And in the y-axis, you see the size of a motor evoked potential normalized to the maximal motor response in the quadriceps muscle. So you can see in these 3 examples, and you can see here also from the graph, the size of the motor evoked potential. These 3 patients have evidence of connectivity from the primary motor cortex, evoked potentials that had a little bit longer latency than what we observe in control subjects, but they were consistent, they were present, and even though the responses are quite small, they were present with electrical or magnetic stimulation. But the green circles show you data in individuals who did not have spasticity, and what we observe is no evidence of descending connectivity from the primary motor cortex. Of course, you can think about, is this a limitation of the equipment that we have? So we use very strong intensities. We ask individuals to perform the Jędrusik maneuver, also to try to increase excitability in the spinal cord, to have more chances of detecting connectivity. We went to very high intensities, increased pulse duration, used double pulses. We did a lot to try to assess the presence of connectivity. And even with that, with those considerations in those individuals, we were not able to elicit responses with the equipment that we have. So then the next question is it possible, if this is really related to descending connectivity, can we detect any changes in atrophy in the spinal cord? But before we go into that data, I just want to show you the size of the motor evoked potentials in control subjects in the quadriceps muscle. This is close to 10% of the maximal motor response in the quadriceps. And this is the data of the group data of people with spasticity. And you can see that it's extremely small, it's less than 1%. Okay. Of the maximal motor response. So you can see that we magnify these responses, but there is a clear responses, but they're extremely small. So individuals have evidence of residual descending connectivity, and we found a small correlation between the severity of the modified Ashville scale and the size, the peak-to-peak amplitude of this motor evoked potential. So the next question was, if this is related to descending connectivity, can we detect changes in the volume of the spinal cord? So we sent patients to the MRI. We acquired a structural MRI, and we did analysis of the volume of the spinal cord between C1 and C2, and we had a collaboration with our colleague from the University of Copenhagen, Henrik Lunde, who also reanalyzed all the data and helped us to understand a little bit more these changes in volume on the area of the spinal cord. So in the left side here is the spinal cord, okay? And this is a patient with no symptoms of spasticity in the quadriceps, and this is a patient with severe spasticity according to the modified Ashford scale. So if you look at the first graph, this is the spinal cord area in millimeters square in the control subject. This is the group data of patients with spasticity, and this is the group data in patients who did not have spasticity. So you can see that overall spinal cords are smaller in patients at that segmental level. We can detect atrophy, but there are several publications before that you can detect atrophy in terms of volume of the spinal cord, several segments above the level of the injury. But what was interesting is that we observed a difference in atrophy. Spinal cord volume seemed to be a little bit smaller in patients without spasticity. So then the question is are these changes in the volume related to changes in left to right direction or anterior posterior? And that could be very important because we have sensory pathways or we have the white matter tracts. So we did a second set of analysis, seeing a major the region from the left to right in millimeters, and also from anterior to posterior, the distance of the spinal cord. And this was extremely interesting. We did not find differences between spastic and non-spastic patients in terms of the area of the spinal cord in the anterior-posterior direction, but we found a significantly different between the group of patients, suggesting in the left to right direction, suggesting that if spinal cords become a little bit smaller, there's more atrophy, this is mainly affecting the lateral parts, which is the white matter tracts are located. So this shows you a different, so you can get an idea of the size of the spinal cord in humans. This is a rat, this is a cat, this is a human, this is coming from the cervical area, this is coming from the low thoracic area, and you can see, and this is coming from the cervical enlargement, by the way. We were measuring just a little bit above the cervical enlargement in the pictures that I showed you before. So this is the rat spinal cord, and the length of the rat spinal cord approximately is 9 centimeters, and this is a human spinal cord, and show you that the diameter is larger in the cervical area than in the thoracic area, and these are just a few segments of the spinal cord. What is important here is that these are 3 papers that measure similar outcomes to our paper with Sina in 2019 or last year. So Henrik Lundell and Jens Bo Nielsen completed similar measurements in 2011 in people with incomplete spinal cord injury. And this is the area of the spinal cord that they found in controls. This is data from Patrick Freund in Switzerland, who also complete very similar analysis in healthy controls and people with spinal cord injury, and this is our data. So you can see that the area or the volume of the spinal cord in control subjects is similar across studies, and also that in patients with incomplete or with complete spinal cord injury, the volume of the spinal cord detected is a little bit less in patients compared to controls. Patrick showed the same result, and we found very similar result. The difference of what we did is to separate patients with and without spasticity. And you can see that the values, again, of people with no spasticity, the volumes of the spinal cord are smaller. So if you don't look at our paper, if you look at the paper by Jens and Patrick, you can see that the area of the spinal cord in patients seems a little bit larger in the study by Jens, 0.67, and the study by Patrick. But they didn't separate patients with or without spasticity. So we are working on an initiative to try to put the data from all these studies together. Sina tested in the scanner for this part of the experiment approximately 20 patients. Jens and Henrik tested approximately 20 patients too, and in the study by Patrick Freund was 10 patients. So if we put all of these together, we can analyze spinal cores and measurements of spasticity in a large population of patients, which is very important. So why do we think this is important? So Henrik Lundell from Copenhagen completed a segmentation of the spinal cord. So he analyzed the relationship of the amount of remaining tissue in different sections of the spinal cord and spasticity. So he found a significant correlation between the degree of spasticity, this is shown here in red, and the area of the spinal cord. So people who have more tissue, which means less atrophy, had more significant spasticity. So the preservation of white matter tracts were related to some extent to the presence of spasticity. So the hypothesis that we have in our laboratory is that the presence of spasticity might be a good indicator of, to some extent, recovery. So then when we go to the paper, this is Sina's paper in 2019, this is Jen's paper in 2011, in incomplete spinal cord injury. So what they did is to correlate the area of the spinal cord with motor scores coming from the INSCI exam. And I'm not sure if you can see this because it's black and white, but these darker lines show that there is a very strong correlation between the area of the spinal cord. So more tissue is present in people who had higher motor scores. And this is a very similar area to what we observed with Sina in our correlation, suggesting that if you have a spasticity, to some extent, you might have better recovery. So in the other paper by Patrick Freund in 2011, he also found a correlation between the cross-sectional area of the spinal cord and changes in voluntary motor output. So patients with higher area or closer to controls were able to perform the 9-hole peg test in lesser amount of time, which means they had more motor function, or they were able to exert more voluntary contractions, maximal voluntary contractions, or their ARAT scores, which is a functional test, were higher, suggesting that there is a relationship between the remaining tissue and some of the motor improvements. So we are currently working on testing the hypothesis is spasticity, connectivity related to recovery. So this test is in collaboration with some of the physical therapists. This is Sarah and Amanda Olson at the Shirley Ryan Ability Lab. So what they are doing is to just collect information in patients who have been admitted to rehabilitation here in Chicago, and we look at their clinical exam before rehabilitation and when they are discharged from the hospital. In parallel, a study with Sina and being one of some of the fellows in the lab, we are also looking at the spasticity and descending connectivity. But I just wanted to show you these few cases where individuals at the beginning of the rehabilitation were had the diagnosis of an AIS-B, and then they recovered function, so they became, their diagnosis was a D or a C, and all of them, or most of them, have a clinically significant spasticity. So this is the working hypothesis in our laboratory that the presence of spasticity might indicate to some extent the possibility of recovery, and this could be is being tested now with these clinical patients. So there are several other reasons why we think electrophysiology can be helpful in understanding more the motor control or the deficits in people with spinal cord injury. But I'm going to show you one more example that and tell you a little bit about changes in corticospinal function. So to assess corticospinal function, we use transcranial magnetic stimulation, and I think a number of you have heard about the technique, and we stimulate non-invasively primary motor cortex, and this is a recording from hand muscle in the control subject, and you can see that the recordings in a patient with a cervical injury, and this motor neurons are located below the level of the injury, these responses have longer latency, have smaller amplitudes, and also higher threshold. And that is more or less very well accepted in the literature in muscles below the level of the injury. Also, the recruitment of these corticospinal responses is changing after spinal cord injury, and the slope of this recruitment is much more decreased. So this is data in a control subject. This participant is performing small levels of tonic voluntary activity, and we use low levels of TM, transcranial magnetic stimulation, increase the intensity a little bit, and we use high intensity. And you can see that the peak-to-peak amplitude of these responses increase progressively with more intensity. But in a patient with spinal cord injury, these increases are are less pronounced. And this was shown by Karen Bundai a couple of years ago. This happened not only during a tonic isometric voluntary contraction, but also during functionally relevant motor tasks such as a precision grip. So this is the second example. Before that. So also these corticospinal responses have not only smaller amplitudes, but the dispersion of the responses are much more pronounced, regardless of how we stimulate the primary motor cortex. So this is a cartoon showing you a coil position where the currents are running from posterior to anterior in that direction, and then we change the orientation of the coil, so the currents are going from anterior to posterior, and these are motor evoked potentials, and I just we changed the gain so you can really see the dispersion of the responses in a control subject. It's very well known that the dispersion of the responses evoked by this coil orientation is larger in control subjects, and you can see that responses in both cases have larger dispersion in a patient. This is data from a patient with spinal cord injury. So smaller responses, higher threshold, longer latencies, and increased dispersion of these motor evoked responses, regardless of the orientation of the coil that we use to stimulate the brain. So another important example, I show you data that spasticity might be a very important outcome where physiology can help us to detect some changes in recovery or in connectivity. So another study which we conducted this years ago, and this started when I was a fellow at NINDS with Leo Cohen. So we asked people to perform increasing levels of voluntary contraction, and then you stimulate the primary motor cortex. We call it active motor cortex, and a number of people have done these experiments. And if you increase the level of contraction and maintain the intensity of transcranial magnetic stimulation constant, the amplitude of your evoked response increases. What is interesting was to observe what happened in the contralateral side that remained at rest. And here again is quite different, because these responses are small. So I changed again, and you can see the responses, the amplitude of the motor evoked potentials, and we instruct people to try to maintain relax in the contralateral side, and especially at strong levels of voluntary contraction. This is 70% of, we were asking people to do wrist flexion. We observe large facilitation of the contralateral homologous muscle. And there are multiple papers that have shown this protocol in upper limb muscles and in lower limb muscles. So with Karen Bundai, this is one of my favorite studies. We we look at how these interactions are happening above the level of the injury and below the level of the injury. But the most interesting part is how are they happening very close to the injury site? How far below the level of the injury are these interactions affected or not? And when do they return to normal? So there could be an area, we know that spinal cord injuries in humans affect more than one segment. So if I contract my finger, do I see cross-facilitation on the contralateral finger? And if I go to other muscles that have lower innervation, how soon do I regain that cross-facilitation? So this is the data let me go back. In order to be able to construct this histogram with Karen, what we did is to test a large number of patients. I think it was about 50 or 51 patients with spinal cord injury and different levels of spinal cord injury. So we recorded and asked them to perform 70% of isometric voluntary contraction with biceps. We also did the motor task with the first dorsal interosseous and also with tibialis anterior. So if you have a cervical, let's say a C2 spinal cord injury, if you are contracting with the biceps, those are muscles below the level of the injury. But if you have a thoracic, let's say a T10 spinal cord injury, biceps and responses and first dorsal interosseous are above the level of the injury. So by taking all this big number of patients together, we were able to construct this graph that is showing here on the right side of the screen. So in the x-axis, you can see the number of segments approximately either above the level of the injury or below the level of the injury on when the muscle tested was very close to the injury site. For example, if I have an individual with a C5 neurological level, and I'm testing the biceps brachii, which motor neurons are mainly located around C5 and C6. That muscle will be close to at the injury site or at the epicenter of the injury. So, and in my graph, this will correspond to 0, 0. So the muscle that I'm testing is very close. The motor neurons are very close to the injury site. And then by going with people with different levels, we were able to construct this histogram. 100% is the size of the response at rest. Everything above 100% means that your motor evoked potential increase in amplitude as a result of the contralateral voluntary contraction. So this is extremely interesting. When we put all the data together, you can see that there's no cross-facilitation between the left and the right side when not only at the injury site, but approximately 4 to 5 segments below the injury site. Okay, and the facilitation that we observed in segments or muscles that we tested when they were above the level of the injury is present. And this facilitation is very close to what we observed in a control subject without spinal cord injury. That is expected. But what was also very interesting is that when we tested individuals with cervical spinal cord injury, the tibialis anterior was several segments, the motor neurons control that muscle as number of segments below the level of the injury. So we observe what we call on those days aberrant facilitation because it was very large. I'll show you in the next slide, facilitation in the tibialis anterior. So this is a representative example. This is an individual with a C3 neurological level of spinal cord injury. So in that case, the biceps brachii motor neurons are located below the level of the injury. This is the motor evoked potential in the biceps brachii at rest and when the contralateral arm is contracted. So there's no facilitation, there's no interaction. In the same patient, if we ask the patient to contract the first dorsal interosseous, which motor neurons are several segments below the level of the injury, we start observing a facilitation. And when we go to the tibialis anterior, which is a number of segments below the level of the injury, you see this very massive facilitation. And I'm going to show you why we refer to this as aberrant facilitation, because in control subjects, when you perform 70% of isometric, tonic, voluntary activity into dorsiflexion, the facilitation that you see in the contralateral motor evoked potential is 20 or 30%. And that is normal. In the upper limb muscles, we see much more. But look at the values in these patients is above 200%. So the MEPs become very, very large. Then we try to investigate what's the mechanism for that. So we look at, this is just a sample of F waves. So these are responses that give you an indication of excitability in the motor neurons from a small group of motor neurons. And this is the F waves, a sample of the same patient at rest. And this is when the patient is contracting the contralateral tibialis anterior. And you can see that the resting responses become very, very large. And the facilitation in the amplitude of the F wave is approximately 20% in the control subject, but in people with spinal cord injury is close to 80%. So it's massive facilitation that is happening very far from the injury site. So these physiological outcomes are quite important for the assessments and for understanding the changes that are taking place close to the injury site, or interactions that are lacking or are not present anymore. Maybe we don't understand still the origin of this large facilitation at very distant segments of the spinal cord. Could be coming from probably spinal. We don't know. But the point that I'm trying to make is that careful assessments that are targeting pathways that are residual and are still available after the injury have a very good role in the understanding of the injury. So I think I still have time. So I'm going to go in the last part of my presentation, just show you some of the one of the neuroplasticity protocols that we have been using since 2012 up to now, and we keep refining. And I'm going to take you a little bit through the rationale of why we keep making changes and why how our outcomes have been evolving during the last several years. So when you think about neuroplasticity and rehabilitation, there are different protocols. We can use transcranial and direct current stimulation, or TDCS. We can use repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation. We can use transcutaneous spinal stimulation, which is very popular on these days. We can use neuromuscular electrical stimulation, nerve stimulation. So there are different paradigms that we use for different purposes. But, you stimulate certain areas of the brain or the spinal cord or the muscle. And then usually we end up combining these approaches with training, pharmacology, or closed loop control in order to make the effects stronger. Because when you use them alone, they work a little bit, it's not sufficient, then you have to go and combine the intervention with something else to make the effect more pronounced or maximize the effect. So there is another group of protocols that we tend to refer as targeted neuroplasticity. And the only reason for the targeted work, in my view, is because we have a physiological connection that we quantify, and we try to use that physiological connections to dictate the paradigm that we use for the stimulation. And one of these is the operant conditioning paradigm that is has been widely used by Jonathan Wolpa and Aiko Thompson, and Pierre associative stimulation that is used by a number of groups, where you stimulate either the motor cortex or a peripheral nerve, or even different areas, to elicit this phenomenon of spike time independent plasticity. But at the same, you also end up combining these approaches with exercise training, pharmacology, closed loop control, and other approaches to make it stronger. So the message here is, in my view, that we still have to think about optimization. Even some protocols, we might think that they're targeting more connections, but they're not sufficient enough. We still need to combine with other interventions in order to hopefully have a more pronounced outcome. So just a little bit the history of Pierre associative stimulation, and this goes, I'm going to start with the first paper referred to as an initial point, the first paper that used transcranial magnetic stimulation in humans in 1985. So the first publication that used this technique in humans, the first paper was published by Katja Estefan in 2000, and she with Joseph Klassen, they targeted the primary motor cortex. So they use stimulation of the hand representation of the motor cortex and the median nerve, and they use different intervals to try to aim to facilitate corticospinal responses. A little bit later, the inhibitory part of that protocol was tested. But what is important, I think one of the important papers that I think they're very interesting in a stroke, that a couple of years later, people was trying to repeat this protocol, on the number of repetitions and see if that can help improve a motor outcome in leg muscles, in this case in stroke. And then it was not until 2009, more or less, that people start using this Pierre associative protocol targeting different areas within the brain. But the important part for us was the paper that was published by Janet Taylor in 2009, who for the first time used the same principle, but instead of targeting the primary motor cortex or somatosensory cortices or primary motor cortices, just target the spinal cord. So what they found in that paper, it was only done in control subjects, they target motor neurons in the biceps brachii, is that by changing the interstimulus interval, you can potentiate corticospinal excitability. They also show that the mechanism is largely, or the origin of those responses is largely taking place at the spinal cortex. Excitability is spinally mediated, and that you could potentiate to some extent voluntary motor output. So with Karen Bundai, we used the same protocol for the first time in people with spinal cord injury, and we customized this protocol to our patients. And this is where our journey with this protocol started. So this is a cartoon on the left side. We stimulate the hand representation of the primary motor cortex. We recorded from the first dorsal interosseous muscle on those years. We stimulated the ulnar nerve. On the right side, this is a cartoon showing you more or less a very simplistic cartoon showing you what we're trying to do. Transcranial magnetic stimulation is used to elicit descending volleys that go to the spinal cord. And we use stimulation of a peripheral nerve to antidromically stimulate and activate motor neurons. And a very, very simplistic cartoon. So the hypothesis is that the arrival of corticospinal volleys prior to the motor neuronal discharge will enhance voluntary motor output in people with spinal cord injury. So in those years, we were very interested in the physiology, and we were trying to potentiate voluntary motor output. But if I look back, I think we were really far from gaining any voluntary control. But so anyway, so this is a cartoon showing you the pathway that we try to stimulate, the hand representation of the primary motor cortex. And one of the main complications or important part of this protocol is that we need to get latencies. We need to quantify latencies in order to make estimations about central conduction time to some extent and peripheral conduction time. And then we can estimate the timing that is needed for facilitating or enhancing plasticity in the spinal cord. So in the first paper, We use only 100 pair of pulses every 10 seconds, just following what Janet Taylor did, more or less. And then we call facilitatory protocol, to the protocol that increase the size of the motor evoked potentials. And in this case, we time volleys to arrive at the spinal cord more or less 2 milliseconds before we depolarize the motor neurons. We reverse the effect in the inhibitory protocol. Still very unclear to us, and why do we need these intervals? There are a few attempts. Janet Taylor in the first paper tested different intervals, and I think I know other groups are doing this work currently to try to understand the difference and the mechanisms involved in this, the timing of these effects. And then we have a control interval where we didn't see effects. So in the first paper in 2012, we stimulated for 17 minutes approximately primary motor cortex and the ulnar nerve at the time where we could potentiate the size of corticospinal responses. And the main outcome was that the amplitude of the motor evoked potentials coming from transcranial magnetic stimulation, or also electrical stimulation, were facilitated or increased in amplitude. And importantly, individuals were able to perform a behavior, functionally relevant behavior, in less amount of time. This was a 9-hole peg test, so individuals were a little bit faster. And on those years, we thought, okay, we are improving voluntary motor output, and we used to call this functionally relevant because in 2012 our goal was just to potentiate a little bit, but we didn't think about how to do it more globally through the central nervous system. So in 2018, we published a second paper with Karen again, after she left the lab and she went back to London. And the only modification that we did to the protocol is to ask people, instead of being at rest when we use the pair stimulation, is to perform small levels of voluntary activity every time that the pair of pulses were applied. So what we observe here is that the number of responders, and we call responders to people who show changes in the magnitude of a motor evoked potential, increase compared to the number of non-responders. And people who did not respond to the protocol in the resting condition actually now started to show small changes in the amplitude of motor evoked potential. So we thought that instead of using the protocol at rest, we're going to use the protocol during small level of voluntary activity. We have more descending volleys. We decrease the threshold of spinal motor neurons, so it's a little bit more effective. So if you think about clinical translation, the next question is, can we use this in different muscles or different representations? So if we tested the possibility of using this protocol in the tibialis anterior muscle, stimulating the leg representation of the primary motor cortex and the common peroneal nerve, we did a lot of electrophysiological outcomes, and we showed that you could elicit this type of plasticity in the leg muscle. So Janet Taylor completed these studies in the biceps bracket. We completed in the first dorsal interosseous and then in the tibialis anterior. So we have pieces of evidence that this might be helpful for patients. So the next question was, and this clinical trial was run very successfully by Hanjin Zhou, and we did this experiment in Miami. And we asked the question if we can use this pair associative stimulation to potentiate exercise-mediated recovery in humans with spinal cord injury. So it took us several years from the time that we started the protocol to now actually run the first randomized clinical trial. And I'm going to show you the results of 2 different groups because we ran 3 groups in the paper. But what was important about this paper is that by the knowledge that this type of plasticity can be induced in different muscle groups, we included people with different levels of spinal cord injury. So if you had descending connectivity and we were able to elicit a motor evoked potential in the first dorsal interosseous muscle, we target the hand representation of the motor cortex and the ulnar nerve. Sorry. If you did not have any evidence of connectivity in the hand, but you have voluntary connectivity or voluntary contractions in the biceps brachii, we stimulated the arm representation of the motor cortex, and we went to the plexus to target the motor axons that innervate the biceps. And then if you had a thoracic injury, for example, and your muscles above the level of the injury are fine, but your leg muscles are affected, we target the tibialis anterior. So I'm just going to show you the data from two of the groups in this randomized trial. A group received pair associative stimulation with exercise training for 10 sessions, and the other group received a sham pair associative stimulation combined with exercise training for 10 sessions. People were randomized to either group. We did a number of physiological assessments before the trial. Then individuals receive approximately 30 minutes of stimulation. We're using 180 pair of pulses now instead of 100. And this is mainly based in the data, some of our preliminary data showing that for leg muscles, we need a higher number of pulses to see the effects. And then patients exercise like in a regular physical therapy training session for approximately 40-45 minutes. And they completed 10 sessions, and then we did assessments immediately after the 10 sessions and a follow-up assessment on average more or less 6 months after the intervention. So this is the first set of, and the hypothesis was that pair associative stimulation will help us to enhance the exercise-related recovery that we will see with physical exercise or physical rehabilitation. So this is the exercises. For the upper limb, we focus on precision grip, gross grasping. We use an arm ergometry. For the lower limb exercises was overground walking, treadmill walking, and also going up and down stairs. So this is the first set of results showing you data from some clinical exams. We use the 10-meter walk test and also the grasp, which measure different aspects of hand and motor function. And this is the group data in the group that received exercise with the pair associative stimulation. And this is the group that received exercise with sham stimulation. So both groups increase. Okay. At this point, if you look at the functional outcomes, these functional outcomes, both groups increase and to a similar extent. The main difference, and this is very critical, I think, it's very important, is that the improvement went back to baseline in the post follow-up measurement in the group that did not receive the real stimulation. So exercise, so it's extremely important to do, I think, these follow-up measurements, and then we start noticing differences between protocols. The conclusion from these studies will be completely different if we don't have the follow-up measurement. We will say that exercise and pair associative stimulation increase to a similar extent the time to complete these two different behaviors in the group that received or did not receive the stimulation. Okay, but at 6 months post intervention, we start to notice the first difference, and there are more differences about the protocols. When we added the electrophysiological measurements, is also when we start detecting differences about the protocols. This is raw data from the biceps brachii and from the tibialis anterior. These are responses before and after the exercise program with pair associative stimulation, and this is before and after sham stimulation. And what you can clearly see here is that the responses after the real stimulation, not the sham stimulation, change. So corticospinal excitability was not changed, only with the exercise, at least with the intensity of the exercise that we use. But with the same intensity, when you use the pair associative stimulation, we see an increase in corticospinal excitability. And it's important that this increase remain. If you look at the black bar here, these increases were present 6 months post-intervention. We also look at maximal voluntary contractions. Unfortunately, we don't have force measurements, but we have electromyographic measurements. In this case, this is an example from the biceps brachii and from the tibialis anterior. And you can see that only the group that received the real stimulation was able to, in that group, we observed some increases in voluntary motor output, but not in the group that received the sham stimulation. And these changes were also present 6 months post-intervention. So it's very important to, I think, combine these clinical outcomes with more physiological outcomes and the follow-up measurements, because if not, the conclusion from the same study could be very, very different. So what are we doing now? So we completed our first randomized clinical trial where we show that it's to some extent possible potentiate a little bit voluntary motor output in different muscles in people with different type of injuries. So, and we observe some changes in motor behaviors and in functional outcomes. So what we are doing now is to use the same principle, but apply to multiple segments throughout to target multiple muscles at the same time. So we have 8 sites of peripheral nerve stimulation. We stimulate the brachial plexus bilaterally. We stimulate the ulnar nerve bilaterally, the femoral nerve bilaterally, and the common peroneal bilaterally. We stimulate the left and the right representation of the primary motor cortex. So, and we try to get to the leg representation or leg corticospinal axons through the spinal cord directly. So think about it. What we did before was just a proof of principle using this pair associative stimulation in the first dorsal interosseous. Now we're testing the same principle in multiple muscles at the same time and bilaterally. So our clinical trial and the serial riot, this started in Chicago since we moved to Chicago. So individuals are enrolled in 40 sessions of stimulation. We take assessments of sensory motor function and electrophysiology. We stimulate for approximately 30 minutes. Then they perform 45 minutes of exercise training. We took assessments again, 20 sessions after and 40 sessions after the training, after the intervention, and we are targeting biceps brachii bilaterally, first dorsal interosseous bilaterally, quadriceps and tibialis anterior bilaterally. This is a course of showing you all the sessions that we have been able to complete. And before we were affected by COVID-19, we managed to finish 40 sessions in 8 individuals with cervical, chronic, incomplete spinal cord injury. And we have to stop all the trials and hopefully restart those patients at some point. So this is one of the first figures that Hanjing generated, and it's a beautiful figure showing you now that what we could do in the first dorsal interosseous at one point, now it can be done bilateral, and it extends the same principle to multiple muscles. So this is a representative figure showing you responses in the left side, before the intervention, after 20 sessions and 40 sessions in both sides of the body. And you can see, which I think is very important, that patients show increases in amplitude. If we compare these changes after 20 sessions with the changes that we observed before, after 10 sessions, these are increasing in magnitude. Of course, we have to be careful. These are different patients, but it seems to be much more pronounced. And importantly, there's no plateau yet. So people continue to increase size of corticospinal responses. We observe something very similar in the maximal voluntary contractions in each of the muscles that we tested. Increases are present, improvements are present, or changes are present at 20 sessions and 40 sessions after the stimulation and training. So we have evidence of changes in quality of life. Unfortunately, I don't have the figures yet, but we quantify changes in quality of life of these individuals, and we have been able to detect changes in bladder function also. So we are very extremely happy with the latest results. So this is this is the first participant. We asked her to jump. This was before the 40 sessions, and she had a cervical injury for 20 years, and this is what she could do after 40 sessions.
Sweet, huh? That's really good. That was more than yesterday. That was more than yesterday. Nice.
So this is another of our patients. He was not included finally in the other trial, but you can see that this is the difficulty that he had before the 40 sessions, and he was able to walk much faster and with more stability after the 40 sessions. I have another video, and where you can see this is after the stimulation, the 40 sessions, and he can't even start the gait, start walking when he's already done. So we are putting all this data together, and we are trying to improve the protocol, and we will continue to improve the protocol, because in our experience, refining the protocol is critical for trying to improve the effects on voluntary motor outcome. So I have shown you some data today that how does the human spinal cord changes after the injury. I hope you remember injuries are bilateral, asymmetric, mostly anatomically incomplete, and this is extremely important for sensory assessments of motor function, and we recently showed that this is also important for assessments of spasticity in individuals with spinal cord injury. Why are more sensitive measurements useful? I think I show you some data that these assessments of connectivity might help us to identify people who have spasticity. There might be a relationship between spasticity and connectivity, and we don't know if this means better recovery, but at least means that there is a connection from the brain that we were able to detect with our physiological outcomes. And we can assess transmission and interactions between the limbs in muscles that are located a little bit below the level of the injury, and how that interaction is affected after the injury. Can we enhance recovery of function after spinal cord injury? Well, the answer is we have seen some improvements with single but much more pronounced with multi-segmental protocols. If I think about years ago when we have to show patients a trace in a computer on a piece of paper to convince them that the plasticity protocol was working, I think things have evolved, but we have, of course, a long way to go to make these effects stronger. So I think our learning experience has been that we have to keep working in optimizing the protocols. We don't have to get happy because we see a 20% increase or 30% increase, because these protocols have to evolve, and this is where you combine physiology or other outcomes. I'm biased for physiology, of course, but you can combine outcomes to make your protocol, understand the protocol a little bit better and make it better. I think for all of us who are working in clinical translation, I think our experience has been that it's very important to combine functional outcomes with physiological outcomes, because the interpretation, especially from that paper from Han-Jin, will be completely different if we only have clinical outcomes or if we only have physiological outcomes and if we don't have follow-ups. So this is our learning up to date. I really want to thank everyone in the lab, especially Bing Shen, Han-Jin Zhou, and Sina Sangari, who were leaders of these experiments that I mainly present today, and also our funding agencies in NMDS, the VA, the Craig Nielsen Foundation, Neidler, the Walkabout Foundation, the Paralyzed Veterans of America. Thank you.
Okay, Monica, thank you very much. Maybe you can stop sharing for a minute so that we can see each other, and we are going to open our wonderful discussion. And first, of course, questions from those who are connected by microphones. So guys, if you want to ask something, go ahead. Yes, Richard.
That was a wonderful presentation, Monica, about the work in general and your significant, highly significant contributions. So regarding the last part of your talk, using the PAS, how would this be on, if we still use the qualification complete spinal cord injury, maybe so what typically would be maybe AIS skill A. So if what's typically still seen as complete, would that also be something you would want to try to apply to?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we unfortunately, because to determine the timing of this plasticity, we need to have some connection that we can detect with electrophysiology. So if we think about patients with AIS-A, maybe those with spasticity, for example, will be the best ones that will qualify because they might have some evidence of descending connectivity. So I think the idea is to use the patients, but right now, if we don't use these connections and we don't quantify electrophysiological outcomes, it's very difficult to determine the timing for this plasticity. So we go to random stimulation. So for us right now, we're very limited to a group of patients, even if they have severe injuries, but they still need to have some evidence of connectivity from the brain that we can calculate, we can detect and measure. Yes.
Thank you.
Marco.
Monica, it's always really nice talk. I learned a lot. I was curious about what happens to your work as the work of others when they try to, I wouldn't say break down, but contribute in a disruptive way. A field which has established itself with certain clinical measures. This happens to a number of clinical situations, right, whereby you're proposing a novel way of looking at connectivity as a window in understanding what kind of targeted therapy you could do. But at the same time, as Richard just pointed out, you're also using scales which don't really match one-to-one, right? In the sense you're providing a different dimension to traditional scales that are used to quantify benefits. So I wonder to what extent the field is responding to this kind of work you're doing, in the sense of, is there any effort or any reconsideration of how the scales are created, how to embed your work into clinical practice? Because ultimately that's what you're driving, right? You want to create some more informative measures. Because I've seen, in several labs where, you try to break that kind of mold, usually there is a bit of resistance in the clinical community because people are used to do things for decades and then they don't want to change it. So I was just curious to see What's the response of the clinical community to this kind of novel measures?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I'm very fortunate that I'm in a hospital. The Shirley Ryan Ability Lab is ideal in the sense that clinicians are very interested in research. So, and we're very close by, so we can have interaction. So, a number of them really value clinical research and how we are trying to make this transition of outcomes. And I give you one example. We just ran a course for clinicians a week ago, 2 weeks ago. And if you look at the questions that they were asking, people, clinicians, physical therapists, occupational therapists, they were extremely interested. If I compare this, their input from this year to last year, I helped to run the course last year, and I have been in other courses, I think is increasing, and especially in an environment where, clinicians are more closer to researchers. So some of the techniques, I agree, they could be intimidating for people. Oh, I have to calculate these latencies, that's too much laboratory and it's not the clinic. But I think instruments as the dynamometer that we're using, or the electrical perceptual threshold, which is a very simple tool to assess sensory function or spasticity in perhaps a little bit more sensitive way, or in a different way that might give us more information, will complement. I think the idea is to complement the clinical exams right now that we have with these measurements, and not all of them have to be that sophisticated, because if not, it's extremely difficult. But some of them are being very well received by clinicians. I'm a physical therapist too, so I think the simplicity of some of those measurements is attractive, and I can see how environments like where I am is also favoring those interactions.
Yeah, got it. Thank you, Onyx.
Okay, Bob, please. Don't turn off your microphone before speaking.
All right, I just wanted to comment on the question by Marco. I think we all confront this, and there isn't really a great system yet for implementation. And so some agencies like NIDLR have started to fund implementation grants, which is exactly that. But I think in therapy, Monica and I and Mindy, who I don't think is in here, and our therapists worked as therapists, and we know that the way that therapists are access information, like new information, is by largely continuing education seminars that they have to go to. They have to get a certain amount of credits, and of course the classroom when they're being trained, as well as materials. And of course, if we can make accessible products, that's great. But for a lot of our science, it's not just the product, and there might not even be a product. And I've been thinking about this a lot, and I think that we have to be active in voicing this need to NIH so that they start thinking. I mean, you can do a phase 3 clinical intervention grant, and then it can be dead from that point, because what you haven't done is figured out how to actually get the information to the therapist. I mean, Monica's in a phenomenal environment, but that's not the nationwide environment that represents, therapists in community clinics. So I just think that's a really important question. And I think we, doing the science, have to advocate to NIH to care about the step after the phase 3, if there is a phase 3 intervention. That's all I wanted to say. Yeah. Monica, this was a phenomenal talk. If more work like yours, then therapy would be revolutionized every day.
Well, I think your work and what Marco is doing, we're all trying to accomplish a similar goal. So, what I have learned throughout the years is try to present this in a way that the therapist can see the value of this, because if you talk with complicated outcomes, they get away a little bit. But actually, I have noticed the interest, and it's important because, if we only use certain outcomes and we leave, of course, I'm biased to physiology, but if we leave others, the conclusions from the same study could be dramatically different. I mean, if we don't follow up, so they can give us funding for, a large randomized clinical trial, but the outcomes are, or the conclusions are very much depending on the outcomes also. So I think you raise a very good point, Bob. We should back to NIH and advocate strongly for the need of these interactions, and especially for the clinical trials, because many of them fail. And sometimes we don't learn too much. And maybe it's because we're not looking at the right outcomes or not at the right time. So I'm sure we all have different experiences and different perspectives, but it's good that all of us who are interested in control of movement, physiology, or other outcomes, to transmit this strongly to people who are in the clinical arena, because when we voice that and we make clear examples of how this can help, and especially the conclusions, I think it's dramatically important. So thank you for the questions. I agree with completely, yes.
Okay, Monica. Well, you know that I love your talks and I love your research. But with all that, we're in a motor control school. So
yes.
Have you ever thought of trying to interpret what your neurophysiological findings in the language of lambdas, referent coordinates, uncontrolled manifolds, and other things that we've been talking about for like the past, dozens of years? Yeah. Or is this wishful thinking?
Yeah, I think the most that, to be honest with you, Mark, the most that I have done is, I think the concept of changes in threshold. That is extremely interesting. And what Nmda has shown about changes in the, you have different spasticity, you measure in different ranges, and the threshold changes. This to me is quite important because there are certain phenomena that we measure in physiology that are based on threshold of motor neurons, and that by changing the threshold of that, an intervention can be perhaps a little bit more effective. So in that sense, I haven't given more thought about, but we should talk with this new collaboration that we are starting. I will be very happy to look into this question.
I would love if you give me a chance to add a couple of tests to your subject.
Yeah, the more that we understand further, isn't it? That's the beauty. Yeah.
Okay, Monica, would you like to take a look at the questions? You have, like half a dozen of questions or so.
Yes,
waiting for you. Please address those.
My friend, off the wall question, Monica, my friend ended up with a drop foot. This happened during an operation of her broken hip when the surgeon evidently nicked her nerve. Are there any exercise to restore it? Well, we can, if there's muscle weakness, there's different type of exercises that they can do, strengthening exercises, more aerobic type of training. I was thinking that this individual was thinking about the Pierre associative stimulation. Thinking about that, we haven't used it in patients with other disorders, but it will make sense that the same concept will apply for people with different type of injuries, as long as you can stimulate the areas of the neural tissue that you need to stimulate and get those latencies. So, Ms. Monica, what is in your opinion about SCATS scale that measures spasticity? Oh, yes. On muscle change instead of evaluating muscles individual. Yeah, we haven't used the scats very much. And my opinion after looking at spasticity on different muscles and in the laboratory, I'm very fortunate that some of my fellows are working in understanding changes in biceps or triceps, and others are working changes in plantar flexors or quadriceps muscles. So we have different numbers or degree measurements of spasticity across different muscles in the same patient, and it changes quite a lot. So especially in people with cervical spinal cord injury, we have some good evidence, and there are other clinical studies that show that the spasticity is a little bit more pronounced in the lower limb than in the upper limb. So I think by saying that, using these general scales to become with one number, I'm a little bit more skeptical, because we have seen differences. Sina is working on a study now where we assess connectivity in multiple lower limb muscles, and we're looking at that relationship to spasticity. So I think, if you ask me what is better, I think it's better to have a quantification of more reduced number of muscles instead of going to a global, because I think you add much more variability. But that is in my experience. Do you have some data on application of vibration direct on muscle and or at the end of the kinetic chain? Well, the only time that we recently completed another study where we look at the effect of vibration. This was done by one of my lab members, Bradley DeForest. So he was looking at the effect of tendon vibration on a cutaneous reflex in an agonist and antagonist muscle, dorsiflexors and plantar flexors. And we show that at certain frequencies, between 40 and 80 hertz, actually you can suppress the amplitude of the long latency cutaneous reflex in people with incomplete chronic spinal cord injury, complete and incomplete. So we think that might be related, that part of the reflex. There's some evidence that the mechanism that contribute are the persistent inward currents. So we are using right now tendon vibration as a probe to try to decrease muscle spasms in people with spinal cord injury. So that's the more. We haven't done too much with vibration apart from that study. Ms. Moni, is there any data that correlates neural activity or spinal cord atrophy in individuals who use drugs or botulinum toxin treatment to reduce tone? I am not aware of any data that look at that specifically. We didn't find any relationship. Also, our sample of the patients from whom we have data from the MRI is around 20 patients, so it's not that large. But we did not see any relationship of those changes with time post-injury, or we correlate with different spasticity medication intake, but I'm not aware of any evidence if the volume will change when you are taking or not taking medication. I guess will be interesting. I think most people with spinal cord injury is taking baclofen or some type of antispasticity medication. And even if they take it for a period of time, then they stop. So it will be very difficult to get a sample, I guess, of individuals who do not take any medication, are pure, unmedicated, in order to assess the effect of medication. And then we have the problem of dose. So I think it will be very, very, very difficult perhaps to go in that direction, but not aware of any study. Your work is so interesting and important. Thank you. Oh, that's Bob. I'm going to have to cut off before. Okay, sorry, excellent work. Okay, comments, Daniela Matos, amazing work, excited for you and your team. Bernstein School by Jose Prias. Thank you, Monica. Okay, thank you. Sorry, I have to go. Daniela can be part of the board to make national exam questions to PT. You can become part of the, okay. There is a group that uses the theory of embodied cognition in their studies to improve perception and remap the sensation of lower limbs with feedback in the arms with the brain-machine interface for people with spinal cord injury. Can we think about using this process in the future to improve neuroplasticity? Or is it the best scenario to use cortical and spinal stimulation? Yeah, I mean, there have been, some groups that are clearly using signals from the brain, invasively or non-invasively, in order to use those signals to control some muscles below the level of the injury. I think our group tends to use more non-invasive approaches. And here, if I think about signals, I think about Sandro Musaibaldi, who is actually using remaining movements, that patients have to control sensors to generate also an interface. So instead of using signals from the brain, he just go to different muscle groups or different areas that have residual voluntary control and control a computer or control different signals. So I think right now the area of interfaces has grown so much that you don't only have, I'm not trying to say that the brain signals are not good, but I think you can use different sources for control, not only thinking in the brain. And I don't know which one is better. To improve neuroplasticity, or is it the best scenario to use cortical or spinal stimulation? Improve neuroplasticity. Yes, I think, every neuroplasticity protocol, as I mentioned at some point, is different. And what is important is to keep following the protocol and keep understanding that protocol, because lessons that we have learned, for example, from RTMS or other methods, might not necessarily be all relevant for other protocols. So I think it's important to follow up with the protocol and understand the protocol to improve neuroplasticity. I would like to know if the use of direct current stimulation at the spinal cord injury site associated with the intensive rehabilitation program can be a starting point, considering the difficulty in accessing technology to conduct clinical studies in rehabilitation centers that we have in Brazil. Yes, our experience with TDCS in the spinal cord, unfortunately, have not been very successful. Every time that we stimulated the spinal cord and we were able to record electrophysiological changes is with other type of stimulations, not with direct current. Even if we go to 4 milliamps, we did not see any changes in excitability of the motor neurons. But we got in touch with, we got a collaboration with Reggie Edgerton and Yuri Gerasimenko, and by using these alternate Russian currents that they have 5 kilohertz, 10 kilohertz, and passing 30 hertz at different intensities, then we were able to see changes in excitability. So I'm not sure how TDCS, how successful it is in getting to the spinal cord. In our experience, we haven't seen too many changes. And I know that in the literature also there are some controversial results about the effect of TDCS on the spinal cord. I love all the concepts, and I wish there were a mechanism to work together in research. One needs a big team to get where you are right now, and people with aligned thoughts, very hard for groups that are starting. I feel that combination approaches are critical. Target plasticity. Yeah, I completely agree, Daniela. I think that combinational approaches are the best. But sometimes combined therapies doesn't give you the best result. I just give you a small example. We just submitted a paper where we use acute intermittent hypoxia with our pair associative stimulation, and both protocols to some extent might induce spinal plasticity. We thought the effect will be much stronger, and we saw better effects in terms of physiology, but not involuntary motor output. So I think combinational approaches are important, but it's also important to determine what do we combine and test that. What are the changes in the neuromodulators after spinal cord injury? I'm thinking about the evidence that C.J. Heckman presented for the role of neuromodulation in motor control. Yes, we haven't tested that too much, but I think the data that I presented today was mainly based on just repeated stimulation of corticospinal neurons and a peripheral nerve. But definitely, I think there is a lot of possible roles for pharmacology, for example, use other neuromodulators that might change Nmda plasticity. We are thinking about combining our approach with D-cycloserine, which is an Nmda receptor agonist, to try to see if we can potentiate the effects. And other people have used other type of drugs also to potentiate the effects. What is your opinion on clinical evaluations to quantify the spasticity? Does the instrumentation EMG passive torque require to separate the neural and stiffness mechanisms? Yes, after the last paper that we recently published with Pink, I think it's extremely important to try to separate both components. I think it's basically impossible to do that with the modified Ashville scale. So I think that there are people that are thinking in devices that can be easily used in the clinic. And we have the device from Jens Bo Nielsen, and I think there is a company behind who is in the process of trying to improve the device in order to be used for clinical translation, because that device is it's still under development. So I think it's important. Yeah, absolutely important after our latest results. Yeah. Thank you. Okay, good.
Oh, Monica, you're done. Perfectly on time. So before we toast Monica, I have to remind that the next talk by Richard Van Emmerik is going to be 1 week from now on Saturday. On Tuesday, we're not going to have a session because of the interference overlap with the NCM session at the same time. So 1 week break. And Monica, cheers to you. Thank you very much for the great talk and your health.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Thanks, everyone. Yep.
Thank you, Monica.
No. Thank you.
Good wine. Italian.
I don't have wine. I have water.
All right. Anyway, cheers. All right. Goodbye, everybody. Thank you.
Again. See everybody.
Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
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 Bye-bye, Gregor, Marco, Mark, Richard, Monica.
Bye-bye.
Have a nice weekend.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye. Okay, as you have heard, Mark has commented that our next presentation, who's going to speak, is Richard Van Emmerik. It's going to be not Tuesday, but Saturday, okay? And most of you who are interested, because there will be a symposium of Society of neural control of movement. And so we, in order to avoid this overlap of presentations, we decided to postpone Richard's presentation. So see you in 1 week on Saturday, same time, same place. Okay? So stay safe. Have a nice weekend. For the Brazilians, today is Santo Antonio's Day. Okay. Although we don't have festas juninas, enjoy this day as well. See you next Saturday. Bye-bye.